Billionaire sees a lonely black waitress crying at his wife's grave. What happens next changes everything. Jonathan Hale stood at his wife Margaret's grave, overwhelmed by the grief that never seemed to fade. Every year, on the anniversary of her passing, he felt the same emptiness, lost in memories and regret. As he placed flowers on the gravestone, something unexpected caught his eye, a young woman sitting nearby, crying softly. He approached her, noticing her worn apron, and learned that she was Emily, a childhood friend of his wife. They hadn't seen each other in years, but Margaret had always spoken fondly of her. Emily was grieving not just the loss of a friend, but the life they once shared. Without thinking, Jonathan sat beside her. The silence between them spoke volumes. "She was the best friend I ever had," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Jonathan felt a strange connection to this stranger, someone who, like him, was mourning Margaret. "I can't imagine what you're going through," Jonathan said, offering her his handkerchief. "But you're not alone." As Emily accepted it, Jonathan realized that, through their shared loss, they had found an unexpected bond, one that would change both of their lives forever. The air was still as they walked toward the nearby cafe. Jonathan, a man used to power and wealth, now found himself silently walking alongside a young woman whose life seemed to be in stark contrast to his own. Emily's shoulders were slumped, her eyes red from crying, and yet she walked with a quiet strength that made Jonathan pause. They entered the warm, dimly lit cafe. Jonathan gestured for them to sit by the window, where a gentle stream of sunlight filtered through the curtains, creating a peaceful scene. Emily hesitated before sitting across from him, clearly unsure about the next step. Jonathan, usually decisive in every aspect of his life, was unsure of how to proceed in this delicate situation. He had never been one for small talk, and yet something told him this moment deserved more than that. "You knew Margaret when you were younger?" Jonathan asked, his voice softer than usual. Emily nodded slowly. "Yes, we were inseparable. I grew up with her, spent so many summers at her family's house. But as we got older, life changed, and we lost touch. I didn't even know she'd gotten married. I had no idea she was gone." Jonathan felt a pang in his chest. Margaret had always been a light in his life, her kindness shining through the years. Hearing Emily speak about her so lovingly stirred old memories, memories of a woman he had once known intimately. A woman who had spent her final days working tirelessly to help others, even when Jonathan had been too preoccupied with business to notice. The weight of regret pressed heavily on him, but there was something about Emily that brought him some comfort. "I never got to say goodbye," Emily continued, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't get to thank her for everything she did for me, for believing in me when no one else did." Jonathan watched her carefully, a mixture of sorrow and admiration in his eyes. There was a rawness in Emily's voice that struck him. She wasn't just grieving Margaret's death, she was grieving lost opportunities, missed connections, and a life that had been left behind in the wake of time and distance. "I'm sorry for your loss," Jonathan said quietly, his gaze softening. I didn't realize how much she meant to you." Emily wiped a tear from her cheek, avoiding his eyes for a moment. "She was everything. And when I saw her gravestone, all those years of wondering what happened came rushing back. I never thought I'd be here, crying at her grave, feeling like I lost a part of myself." Jonathan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His mind was spinning, overwhelmed with a need to make things right, not just for himself, but for Emily too. He didn't know what had brought her to this point in her life, but there was a sense of urgency to his thoughts. Margaret had always believed in second chances, in helping others. What if this was one of those chances? "I can't bring her back," Jonathan said softly, "but I can help. You've been through a lot, I can see that. I know it's not much, but I'd like to help you get back on your feet. I'm offering you a chance, if you'd like it. A job at my company. A fresh start." Emily blinked, surprised by his words. She hadn't expected this, certainly not from a man who had just lost his wife. Her eyes searched his face, unsure of whether this was some sort of charity or if he genuinely meant it. "Why would you want to help me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't have anything to offer in return. I'm just a waitress, nothing special." Jonathan looked at her, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "You're wrong. You're far more than just a waitress. You have strength, and that's something we could use. I see that in you. It's not about what you can give me, it's about giving you a chance." Emily was silent for a moment, unsure how to process his words. She'd spent so much of her life feeling invisible, working hard just to make ends meet, always overlooked, always dismissed. But this was different. This was an opportunity. An unexpected lifeline. "Why now?" Emily asked, her voice low. "Why after everything?" Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "Because Margaret believed in second chances. She used to say that no one ever truly leaves us if we keep their memory alive. I think this is what she would have wanted. For me to help you." There it was, a sense of closure, not just for him, but for Emily as well. His offer wasn't just about a job or money, it was about healing the wounds they both carried. It was about honoring Margaret's memory and giving Emily the opportunity to rebuild her life. Emily nodded slowly, the weight of her own grief slowly lifting. She could feel it, the shift, the possibility of something better. This wasn't the end. It was a new beginning. As they stood to leave the cafe, Jonathan felt something stir inside him. This wasn't just about business. This wasn't just about the past. It was about the present, and what they could both do moving forward. "Thank you," Emily said quietly, looking up at him with gratitude. "I never expected this. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Jonathan replied, his voice steady. "Just take the chance. I'll be there to help." They stepped outside into the cool air, the world seeming to open up before them. Jonathan had come here to visit Margaret's grave, but now, standing beside Emily, he realized that what he had found wasn't just the ghost of his wife. He had found a new connection, a new purpose, a chance to make amends, to heal old wounds, and perhaps to honor Margaret's legacy in a way he hadn't expected. The next few weeks passed in a blur for Emily. At first, she was overwhelmed by the sudden change in her life. Jonathan's offer had seemed like a fleeting hope, something that came too easily and too unexpectedly. She'd spent so many years scraping by, convinced that a life of hard work in a tiny diner was her fate. But now, she was standing at the threshold of something much bigger. Jonathan's company, a prestigious firm known for its philanthropy and global reach, felt like a world completely foreign to her. The offices were sleek, the staff impeccably dressed, and the expectations seemed almost impossible. She found herself questioning whether she belonged. Could a waitress, someone with no formal education or connections, really make a difference here? But every time she doubted herself, she thought about Margaret. She thought about how Margaret had always told her that the world wasn't as cold as it seemed. "People are more than their circumstances," she had said. "And you, Emily, you've got something special." Margaret had always believed in her, even when Emily didn't believe in herself. Jonathan had kept his word. He guided her through the first few days with patience, introducing her to his team and showing her the ropes. The job wasn't glamorous. She was starting in a modest administrative position, but it was a start. She felt like a fish out of water, and yet, there was something about it that made her want to try. The people around her treated her with a kindness she hadn't expected. No one looked down on her for her past. One afternoon, as Emily was finishing up some paperwork, she was called into Jonathan's office. She knocked softly on the door before entering. "Emily, come in," Jonathan said, his voice warm. He motioned for her to take a seat. "How are you feeling? Settling in?" Emily nodded, though she still felt like she was treading water. "It's been a lot to take in. But I'm getting there." Jonathan smiled, his eyes reflecting a deep understanding. "You're doing well. And we're grateful to have you here. I know this is all new, but I've seen your work ethic, and that's all that matters. Keep pushing yourself. You're capable of more than you think." It was moments like these that made Emily question her doubts. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was someone with a purpose, someone who could contribute in a meaningful way. However, even as things seemed to improve, Emily could feel the weight of her past creeping in. She had an abusive ex-boyfriend, Marcus, who refused to let go of their relationship. He'd been part of her life for years, and though they'd broken up, he still found ways to manipulate and control her. Emily had tried to escape him, but he always found a way back into her life. The calls, the messages, it all started to feel suffocating again. One evening, as she was finishing her shift, her phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. Her hands shook as she read the words, each one like a dagger in her chest. He was threatening to show up at her workplace, to make sure she knew he wasn't done with her. He wanted her back. The weight of his words lingered in her mind, threatening to crush her resolve. She knew she had to make a decision. She couldn't keep running from him forever. But Emily wasn't ready to give up the life she was starting to build. She couldn't let Marcus drag her back into the darkness she had just escaped from. The next day, as Emily arrived at the office, Jonathan could see that something was off. She was quieter than usual, her eyes distant, a tightness in her shoulders that hadn't been there before. He noticed her discomfort, but he didn't press. Instead, he waited until they were alone later in the day. "Emily, you seem a bit off today," Jonathan said gently. "Is everything okay?" Emily hesitated, her gaze falling to her hands in her lap. She wanted to tell him about Marcus, about the emotional toll he was taking on her. But she felt embarrassed. How could she explain the mess that was her life to someone like Jonathan? He had everything: success, respect, security. What could he possibly understand about her struggles? But as Jonathan looked at her with those patient eyes, she felt a flicker of trust. For the first time in a long while, she considered that maybe she didn't have to carry this burden alone. "He's back," Emily said quietly, barely above a whisper. Jonathan's face softened, and for a moment, there was a deep understanding between them. "Marcus," he said, nodding slowly. "I see." Emily nodded, her eyes welling with tears. "He's always there, in the background. I don't know how to get away from him. I'm afraid if I stop answering his calls, he'll show up here. He knows about the job. He knows everything." Jonathan leaned forward, his voice steady but filled with concern. "Emily, I know it's not easy. You don't have to fight this alone. We'll find a way to make sure you're safe. No one should feel like they're living in fear." The words of reassurance hit her like a bomb. For so long, she'd felt like there was no way out, but now, she realized there were people who cared. People who were willing to stand by her, to help her find the strength to reclaim her life. "Thank you," Emily whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Jonathan's gaze softened even more, and he placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't need to thank me. We're a team now." The realization that she didn't have to face this fight alone was both comforting and empowering. She felt a spark of hope, a light breaking through the darkness. She wasn't sure how everything would turn out, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a fighting chance. As the days passed, Emily became more determined to take control of her future. With Jonathan's support, she began taking steps to block Marcus from her life for good. But deep down, she knew there would always be challenges ahead. She was starting to believe, however, that no matter how difficult things got, she was stronger than she had ever known. But just when she thought things were getting better, the situation took an unexpected turn. The days seemed to stretch on as Emily continued to navigate the delicate balance between work and her personal turmoil. While she felt a growing sense of empowerment at her job, the weight of Marcus's presence in her life continued to loom large. Every phone call, every unexpected message sent a jolt of anxiety through her body. The tension in her chest was constant, like a tight knot that refused to loosen. One morning, just as she was preparing for her shift, she received another message from Marcus. It was different this time. No threats. No angry words. Instead, the message was brief, almost casual. "I'll be at the diner today. We need to talk." A chill ran through Emily's spine as she read the words over and over, her mind racing. She had been trying to avoid him, keep him at arm's length, but now he was forcing her into a confrontation she wasn't prepared for. He had always been good at getting under her skin, making her feel like she had no choice but to listen to him. She had no idea what he would do next, but she felt the familiar panic rising in her chest. As the hours passed, the anxiety only grew. Emily had a deep sense of dread in the pit of her stomach. She hadn't told Jonathan about the latest message. She didn't want to worry him further, especially when everything seemed to be going so well with the job. But at the same time, she knew she couldn't handle this alone anymore. She had tried for years to keep her problems hidden, but the weight of it all was starting to take its toll. Jonathan was waiting for her in the staff break room when she arrived, his calm presence immediately putting her at ease. His kind smile was the only thing that seemed to ground her in the midst of the storm swirling inside her. But as soon as their eyes met, he noticed the change in her demeanor, the tension in her posture, the far-off look in her eyes. "Emily," Jonathan said softly, his voice filled with concern. "What's going on? You're not yourself today." Emily swallowed hard, fighting the lump in her throat. She didn't want to burden him with her problems, especially not when he was so busy running the company. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw nothing but kindness. Nothing but the steady presence of someone who genuinely cared. She realized then that maybe it was time to stop hiding. "I got a message from Marcus today," she said, her voice trembling as she spoke. "He's coming to the diner. He says we need to talk." Jonathan's expression darkened, his usual calm replaced by a sense of urgency. "Have you told the police?" Emily shook her head, feeling a surge of guilt. "No. I didn't want to make it worse. I thought maybe if I ignored him, he'd just go away. But now I don't know what to do." Jonathan stood up from his chair, walking toward her with a sense of purpose. "You don't need to face this alone. You've got people who care about you now. Me, the people at this company. We'll figure this out." For the first time in a long time, Emily felt a flicker of hope. Jonathan's words were more than just comforting, they were a lifeline. She wasn't alone. She didn't have to carry the weight of her past all by herself anymore. "I'm not going to let him hurt you," Jonathan said firmly. "We'll make sure he knows he doesn't have any power over you anymore." But just as the words left Jonathan's mouth, Emily's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a phone call. Her heart raced as she saw the familiar number on the screen. "It's him," she whispered, her hand trembling as she answered. "Emily," Marcus's voice came through the phone, cold and demanding. "I'm outside the diner. We need to talk now." Jonathan took a step closer, his eyes locked on Emily's. "You don't have to go through this alone. I'll be right there with you." The decision was made in that moment. Emily wasn't going to let Marcus have control over her any longer. She wasn't going to hide or cower. She was stronger than that now. She stood up, gathering the courage to face him, to face her past. "I'm not afraid of you anymore, Marcus," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. "This ends today." As she walked out of the break room, Jonathan by her side, Emily felt a rush of determination she hadn't felt in years. For the first time in her life, she wasn't running from the pain. She was confronting it head-on. And with Jonathan's support, she knew she could take control of her future. When they reached the front of the diner, Marcus was waiting outside, leaning against his car. His cold eyes locked onto Emily's as she approached. But this time, there was no fear in her heart. Only resolve. "What do you want, Marcus?" she asked, her voice steady. He smirked, his usual arrogance in full force. "I just want to talk. We need to settle things, Emily. You can't keep running from me." Jonathan stepped forward, standing tall beside Emily. "She's not running anymore, Marcus," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And she doesn't owe you anything. You need to leave." Marcus's eyes flicked to Jonathan, and for a moment, there was a flash of recognition. But it didn't last. Marcus sneered and turned on his heel, stalking off without another word. Emily stood there, watching him go. For the first time in years, The weight she had carried for so long seemed to lift. The darkness, the fear, the shame, it was all starting to fade. And in its place was a sense of freedom she hadn't known in years. Jonathan placed a hand on her shoulder, offering her a silent reassurance that spoke volumes. "You're free now," he said softly. The next few days were a blur for Emily. The relief she felt after confronting Marcus was overwhelming, but it came with a mix of emotions. She had been so used to living in fear that now, without the constant anxiety clouding her thoughts, everything felt strangely quiet. She found herself reflecting on what Jonathan had said, that she was finally free. And it was true. The burden that had weighed so heavily on her shoulders for so long was finally gone. But with that freedom came a deep sense of uncertainty. What was she supposed to do now? The job at Jonathan's company had been a lifeline, but Emily wasn't just thankful for the opportunity. She was beginning to believe in herself again. She started spending her nights studying, learning everything she could about the business world. She was driven, no longer willing to let her past define her. Jonathan had been true to his word. He offered her more responsibilities at work, giving her the chance to prove herself. She was no longer just the waitress who had stumbled into the world of high-powered executives. She was Emily, someone with potential, with the drive to make something of herself. One evening, as she sat in her apartment, going over reports Jonathan had entrusted her with, her phone buzzed. It was a message from her mother. "Emily, I know it's been a while, but I'm coming to see you tomorrow. I need to talk." Emily's stomach tightened at the message. She hadn't spoken to her mother in over 2 years. Their relationship had been strained for as long as she could remember, filled with misunderstandings, arguments, and a deep sense of abandonment. The thought of facing her mother again stirred a mix of resentment, fear, and confusion. But she had changed. She wasn't the same woman who had lived in the shadow of her mother's harsh words and neglect. Emily had fought too hard to let her past pull her down again. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that this meeting might be the final piece of her emotional puzzle. She had to face it, just like she had faced Marcus. She couldn't keep running from her family. The next day, her mother arrived at her apartment, her presence as imposing as ever. It had been years since they had last spoken, but Emily could still feel the weight of her mother's judgment, even before the doorbell rang. When Emily opened the door, her mother stood there, dressed in the same conservative clothes that Emily remembered from her childhood. She was older, but the stern expression had not changed. She didn't smile. Instead, she stepped inside with a quiet sense of authority, as though she still held power over the space. "Emily," her mother said with a cold, almost forced politeness. "It's good to see you." Emily couldn't help but notice how distant her mother seemed. The years of silence had left a chasm between them, one that no amount of time could easily bridge. But Emily was determined to try. She wasn't that scared girl anymore, unable to stand up for herself. She had grown stronger, more resilient. "I'm glad you're here," Emily replied, though her voice trembled slightly. "I've changed a lot since the last time we spoke." Her mother's eyes flickered with something, guilt perhaps, but she quickly masked it with a stoic expression. "I know. I've been keeping track of your job at Jonathan's company. You've done well for yourself. But that's not why I'm here." Emily braced herself. She knew this conversation wasn't going to be easy. But she wasn't afraid anymore. "I'm sorry, Emily," her mother said softly, her voice laced with regret. "For everything. I never should have treated you the way I did. I know I wasn't the mother you needed. And for that, I'm sorry." The words hung in the air, unexpected and heavy. Emily felt her heart race, a mixture of disbelief and relief flooding her chest. She had always wanted to hear those words, but she hadn't expected them to come from her mother. Her mother's eyes softened. "I know I can't change the past, but I want to try. If you'll let me." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she took a deep breath. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment she could either forgive her mother and move forward or hold on to the resentment that had built up for years. "I don't know what to say," Emily whispered. "It's been so long. So much has happened." Her mother nodded, her expression one of understanding. "I know. But I've been doing a lot of thinking, Emily. I don't want to keep making the same mistakes. I want to be part of your life again, if you'll have me." The words she had longed to hear had finally come, but they felt bittersweet. Emily's heart ached as she thought about everything they had lost. But in that moment, she realized something. She didn't need to carry the weight of the past anymore. She didn't have to keep it all locked inside. She could forgive, and in doing so, she could release herself from the pain that had defined so much of her life. "I want to try too," Emily said, her voice trembling but strong. "It's not going to be easy. But we can start over." Her mother nodded, tears welling up in her own eyes. "I'm so sorry for everything, Emily. I was wrong. I know I can't undo the hurt, but I hope we can find a way to move forward." In that moment, Emily felt a lightness she hadn't experienced before. For so long, she had carried the weight of resentment, of never feeling good enough. But now, she was free. She didn't have to let the past define her anymore. She could heal, she could forgive, and she could finally be whole. As the days passed after reconnecting with her mother, Emily felt herself transforming. The relationship was not perfect, but the effort to rebuild it brought peace. Her job at Jonathan's company flourished, and she took on more responsibilities, slowly growing into the woman she always wished she could be. One day, Jonathan pulled her aside with big news. "Emily, we want you to head a new project. You've earned this opportunity." The recognition made her heart swell with pride. She hadn't realized how much she'd doubted her potential until this moment. Tears welled up, but they weren't from sadness, they were from gratitude. She had come so far. She no longer needed anyone's approval to feel worthy. That evening, Emily received a call from her mother. "I'm proud of you," her mother said, her voice filled with sincerity. "You've come so far, and I'm sorry for not being there sooner." Emily smiled. "It's okay, Mom. I'm glad we're here now." She hung up, feeling a warmth she hadn't known in years. In that moment, Emily realized she was free. Free to build the future she deserved, no longer bound by the past. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and subscribe for more heartwarming stories. Thank you for being part of this journey. Emily's journey was just beginning, and with hope in her heart, she was ready for whatever came next.